Thank you, Senator Merkley. Thank you, Chris Smith. And thanks to CECC for organizing this hearing. I am Zhou Fengsuo, Fengsuo Zhou in English. I'm currently Executive Director of Human Rights in China and President, co-founder of Humanitarian China. I was a Tiananmen student leader 35 years ago. It is my honor and duty to testify today as a survivor of Tiananmen massacre. October 2022, I was at the Halloween parade with a group of young protesters. I was the only adult in the group for about 50. But look around, I know more among them than anyone else. Some of them were guests at my home. Some visited the Tiananmen exhibition. Some were kids of my fellow protesters from Tiananmen. I was really touched when one of them told me that he was arrested a few years ago on Tiananmen Square, commemorating Tiananmen massacre in the very place it happened, even though at that time nobody knew about this. As I was standing there, I was excited and inspired. And then, without my prompting, they chanted, "Down with CCP, down with Xi Jinping." At that moment, I was in tears. I realized that after 33 years, we are finally seeing the younger generation. They are stepping up to carry on the torch of freedom that I carried with me since 1989 from Tiananmen Square. In 1989, I was a physics student at Tsinghua University. I was among the first to protest on Tiananmen Square after Hu Yaobang's death. Hu Yaobang was a former party secretary of CCP, but his death signaled the death of reform in China. That's why we are concerned. That's why we went to Tiananmen Square to protest. And then, on this very day, 35 years ago, I was among the last to leave Tiananmen Square. When the tanks were rolling in, the soldiers were pointing guns at us, and one of the tanks was only 20 feet away from me. In between these 2 days, I witnessed the most incredible outpouring of Chinese people in support of freedom and democracy. Millions of people gathered on Tiananmen Square from all walks of society. Not only students, but also journalists, communist government officials, Christians, Buddhist monks, even police and soldiers. It was also my first time meeting people from Hong Kong and witnessing their strong support and learn from them the techniques of civil society. The solidarity at that moment was so overwhelming, strong, and inspiring. I installed dozens of loudspeakers on the monument to the heroes at the center of the square. And for the first time, the people's real voices were heard, echoing across this huge plaza. At the very center of Communist China's political power. In that moment, many Chinese people who were fearful and quiet became expressive and articulate, sometimes even jubilant. Freedom was in the air. Democracy was almost within reach. Unfortunately, I also witnessed the brutal massacre of these peaceful protesters by the troops armed with tanks and machine guns. The pungent smell of tear gas, the bullet holes in the buildings, the rolling tanks, armored vehicles, and the dead bodies outside of the hospital in a bicycle shed because the hospital was so overwhelmed with these who were injured and killed. That was a war. It's a war conducted by CCP's invading army against freedom-loving Chinese. I remember seeing Zhong Qing among these who died. He was a younger classmate of me at Tsinghua University, but he died for our shared dream of a free China. He was a third-year student studying instrument at Tsinghua University. I was shocked beyond belief. I couldn't comprehend what I was witnessing. I realized I must carry on his name and continue speaking out for his behalf. The protesters were not the only ones who suffered under the government's attacks. The military's brutal siege of the capital encountered courageous resistance from people of Beijing. When martial law was first declared, millions of people poured out from their homes to block the troops. Many of them stood in front of the marching soldiers and the rolling tanks in order to protect students like me. Some of them carrying their children on their shoulders just to show the soldiers that Beijing was peaceful. This is why the world witnessed the great tankman, who has since become the most important icons of last century, representing courage against overwhelming power and violence. To date, I'm often asked who this tankman is. We probably will never know. Had he survived, he probably wouldn't even realize the significance of his move, because there were many like him who stood in front of the tanks. The whole world watched as the Chinese government turned against its own people and murdered peaceful protesters. Yet, President Bush sent in a special envoy to inform the butcher of Beijing, Deng Xiaoping, of the support of US government, even after the senseless massacre. Within 10 days, probably, the CCP took the wrong path after 1989, setting the country on the trajectory of ever-increasing political repression and human rights violations. That is why later, this very regime would put Uyghurs in concentration camps, would force Tibetans into self-immolation, and would deprive Hong Kong of its freedom. If a regime can use tanks in broad daylight to kill its own people and still enjoy the support of the most democratic countries in the world, there's no limit to what it could do, both in terms of internal repression and external aggression. That's why we are seeing the China today. Domestically, CCP chose to erase the memories of the massacre through censorship and brutal repression. It tightened its grip on free speech, banning any mention of the reality of what happened on Tiananmen Square, and in the rest of the country, to the extent that many young people today had never heard about it. 20 years later, after the death of my classmate Zhong Qing, his brother visited Tiananmen Museum in Hong Kong, and that was the first time he learned why his older brother died. This museum was shut down by CCP after the national security law. That's why we are building museums here. There's one in Manhattan. Perhaps in 1989, CCP could have taken a different path, transforming itself into a social democratic party, but the massacre and the crackdown eliminated the ability of this regime to be positively changed through mere trade and investment. United States government have deliberately put their heads in the sand, ignoring the cause of human rights activists and political prisoners in China. This strategy may have brought short-term gains in form of increased profit and lower inflation, but appeasing CCP for the benefit of trade has proven to be self-defeating and self-destructive. What Tiananmen told us 35 years ago till today. The most important lesson is that United States policy towards CCP regime must focus on the democratization of China. Without democratization, the regime will become even stronger threat toward universal values, including freedom and human rights. Okay, I'm running out of time. Okay, let me just quickly finish this. Today we remember Tiananmen because it reminds us of what a different China could have been, because Chinese people demonstrated their love for freedom and democracy through their protests and resistance. The fight didn't stop then. For most of us, it was only the beginning of our journey. Liu Xiaobo gave up a position as visiting scholar at Columbia University to go back to China to join the students on Tiananmen Square. He refused to leave China and died as the first and only Nobel Peace Laureate in prison without ever seeing the award. Xu Zhiyong was only a high school student, but the protest and the massacre awakened him. He resolved to dedicate his life to the dream of a free, democratic, and beautiful China. His New Citizens movement gained tens of thousands of followers from all over China. He was recently sentenced to 14 years in prison. For me personally, it has been a privilege to work with these amazing freedom fighters to raise awareness of their suffering, their sacrifice, their dreams, their goals, and to support Tiananmen mothers and the other victims of the Tiananmen massacre and the crackdown. Even though the Tiananmen protest and the massacre remain a source of trauma for Chinese people, it has simultaneously become a tremendous source of inspiration, healing, and hope. That's why I have collected many relics and artworks from 1989. Each of these items carry a story of life and death, of strength and endurance that is difficult to find anywhere. I have with me this blood-stained tower. This tower was made 1983. In the morning when we were leaving Tiananmen Square, someone was shot. This tower was used to wipe the blood of the person who was wounded. This is evidence of the murder. It's also a sign of hope and life, because this was kept for 33 years in China, very carefully against the government's surveillance for 2 generations, and gifted it to me last year. This T-shirt was made by the students who created the very sculpture of goddess of democracy on Tiananmen Square. This was the reason millions of people protested on Tiananmen Square. Democracy and freedom for China. Thank you.